seem all right at the moment. So from the start, learning from pre-growth economies. This one is called my presentation. So that's me. I'm Yin. I'm a Wakaya man. I work at Deakin University. Do a lot of stuff on decolonisation, Indigenous knowledges, racism, anti-racism, cultural safety, and so on. These sorts of things. So what is an economy? Economy is from the Greek word, which I'm not going to try and pronounce, meaning household management. Yeah, there's no such thing as a free market, obviously. The market has always been propped up, underpinned and enforced by nation-state regulations, interventions, bailouts, coercions and violence and so forth. So modern economies are very problematic. Household management doesn't sound that bad, but in practice hasn't turned out very well in recent centuries. Modern economies are fantastically complicated systems designed around profit growth, in contrast to pre-growth economies, obviously, which sought steady state sufficiency and predictability of some extent of their environments to some extent, but not control, not forced control. And those were all nested within deeply layered, emergent, cyclical, complex systems, which of course are different from complicated systems. We'll talk about that later. So the evident problem for our economy, the modern one, is that we have this linear approach to resource extraction, production, distribution, consumption, and waste. That's the traditional method of doing things. But the more fundamental predicament is that our whole economy is based on production and growth that comes from colonization, rent, extraction, time, energy, and wages in the form of slavery of various forms, wage slavery and so forth. We got the capital, which is about compound interest or sort of really exponential growth, accumulation, and very much based on inequality, as that's central to the whole thing. Profits and so forth. So this is the real economy that we're in. Sound is a bit low. All right, well, I'll speak louder. And so we have here what's known as the circular economy, where we take the line and make it into a circle, and that gives us recycling. Yay! That's been going on for some decades now, recycling, and material recovery, and so on and so forth. So it's a tweak to modern economies. It doesn't really do much, but it's there anyway. And by the way, recycle your plastics, especially your soft plastics, because we can really do that well these days. So what's the deal with modernity anyway? Modern economies are based on the broader notion of modernity, colonial modernity, and there's a lot really of aspects or elements of modernity, modern societies. Some of them are here: quantification and objectivity, rationalism and reductionism, determinism and continuity, standardization and systemization, weaponization and instrumentalization, not necessarily actual weapons, but there's plenty of those too, and abstraction and force. So these are key aspects of manners of our modern societies. Now, the malaises that we're dealing with, which directly relate to economies, are really about property. Private property is a big issue that's been going on for a while, taking over the whole world and privatizing it. Artificial scarcity and demand, profit and accumulation, hierarchy, individualism as an ideology, exploitation, competition. Competition is a kind of add-on. It's like a bolt-on to modern economies. It's not really necessary, but it's a strong ideology that we like to talk about and pretend is important. It is a feature of modern societies, though, even though economies naturally tend towards monopolies and monopsonies without intervention from government agencies of various kinds. So commodification of person, time, places, resources, so-called resources, natural resources, control, conformity, coercion, compliance, cruelty, and so on, are intrinsic to the system. Production, distribution, exchange controlled by wealthy elite. Resource extraction from the majority via industrialized labor. Profit is privatized and cost and risk is socialized in the form of, bailouts of big banks and so forth. So the deeper manacles of modernity are really about our separation from ourselves, other people, beings, land, sea and sky, which denies our interdependence and vulnerability to the world. This notion of unrestricted autonomy, entitlement, merit, innocence, it's not our fault and all this jazz, even though we are complicit in all the harm and violence and exploitation of our modern systems. In exponential growth, which I've mentioned, progress, narratives, accumulation, waste. This is the linear economy stuff again. You can't have infinite growth on a finite planet, and so on, as we know. Certainty, surety, mastery, and control that offer simplistic solutions to complex predicaments that deny the tremendous challenges we collectively face at this juncture of the world. So modern societies are transactional societies. They're about individual accumulation and consumption, infinite growth at any cost, security or risk insulation, a lot of talk of risk, calculation of risk, insurance, is about risk, comfort and convenience, technological progress and nature as a resource or natural resources. So-called freedom, meritocracy and status seeking. These are aspects of transactional societies which we find ourselves in, very much related to the economy. Now, what can we do about it? Well, first of all, we can tap into the immense joy that comes from forgetting who and what we think we are and instead sensing the gift of not only being what we imagine ourselves to be. That's important. Imagination is more important than knowledge, as Einstein allegedly said, and it's true. So moving from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy can happen. It's possible, anyway. So that's about bringing power down to the local level, drawing down, as it says here, building something new, investing in that, divesting from stuff that doesn't work, starving and stopping. Values filters, values are very important as part of that. Participatory forms of economy and society, caring and sacredness, cooperation, these sorts of things. So these are all ways of reformulating and transforming the economy from what we have to something else. And that's about thinking global, acting locally. The local is very important, I think, in this discussion. So tuning into the radical abundance of so-called nature, belonging as togetherness, starving modernity, different ways of doing that, and various aspects of modern economies will have to go in a sustainable economic future. So this includes things like stock labour markets, commercial interest or compound interest, commercial banking, subsidies, commercial advertising, planned obsolescence, and so forth. All the stuff, all the wealthy elite stuff that goes on, and the exploitation of the masses. So we can do that, like I said, locally. There's lots of ways of making that happen slowly over time, from the small to the large, networked of the small, really. So a lot of that will involve relinquishing debt, money, private property. Institutions are problematic. Nation states are very problematic. And getting rid of this ideology of competitiveness and participating in life together with each other. So not consuming so much, but participating. So that's a definite possible change to more conscious, simple, frugal, sufficient, joyful, pleasurable lives. Now, I just wanted to end by talking about what primal economies or pre-growth economies, indigenous economies were like. There's a bridge back to those, but it takes a long time to get there. Lots about gift giving as reciprocity and relationship renewal, care, trust, inherent worth, and a fierce egalitarianism, which we can talk about later. Ritualized sharing alongside deep kinship obligations. So it's from rationed access to radical abundance and from consumption of to connection with. From scarce resources to sacred relatives who sustain us through their sacrifice that we honour by striving to stay in sustainable balance with all life. So relatives are not just humans, but trees and animals and so forth. So that's the general gist of how indigenous economies basically worked across the world before modernity. And that brings me to the end of my slides and probably my 15 minutes as well. Who knows? Who's counting? Tarek might be counting.
I am certainly not counting very closely. I'm keeping a general, yeah, look at the amount of time we have and we're not going over. So as long as that doesn't happen, it's all gravy. Yeah, so who's going next?
Terry.
All right. I'll, yeah, let you introduce yourself, but you are on mute, so
I'd like to share my slides.
yeah, you should be able to do that like Yin did, but I'll make you a co-host just in case.
Okay. Um, Wait a minute. What's happening here? Share. Oh, down there. Press that. All right. Okay. Your screen sharing. Good. All right. Okay. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from the lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people, and the land was never ceded. Thanks very much, Yin, for a very interesting talk, and there's heaps that I agree with totally in what you just said. So my most recent book is on the gift economy. It's called System Change for a Livable Future, and it's published by Mayfly. So if we look at the sort of anthropological accounts of pre-class societies, of stateless societies, they talk about three different types of exchange, which I'll go into. Generalized reciprocity is the first one, then balanced reciprocity, and then finally a trading similar to what we see in capitalist societies. So here's a picture of the pictures from the Kung of the Kalahari Desert, Africa. So these are societies which were dominated as their economic form by generalized reciprocity, which I'll explain in a minute. And then Marcel Mauss, who's very famous for having written the book on the gift economy and the sort of anthropological theory of the gift economy, was concerned with examples of balanced reciprocity, which I'm going to talk about. And one of those was the potlatch ceremonies of Northwest America, of the coast of Northwest America. We're aware of that, you'll recognize this image, etc. And these are ceremonies in which chiefs and their close associates would hold huge festivals and give away or even destroy various sorts of wealth, such as blankets, pieces, copper ornaments called coppers, or even slaves. The Kula Ring of the Trobriand Islands was another society that Mauss talks about. And this is a picture of Bronislaw Malinowski on the Trobriands when he was researching this stuff, which Malinowski made use of his ethnography. And this is some pictures from the film Onka's Big Mocha, which is about mocha ceremonies in the Papua New Guinea highlands. Okay, so I might just go back. So in the Kula Rings gift exchanges, chiefs would compete on different islands to give away more stuff. So the main items that would be given would be shell armbands and shell necklaces. And so they'd set out with the chief, with the influential men from their island community, on an ocean-going ship. They'd travel to another island and give various gifts to their exchange partners. The aim then was for the second island, let's call it Island B, to come back in the other direction on a boat, of course, and then and give more gifts. So these gifts are competitive, and status is achieved by giving more. The mocha ceremonies of Papua New Guinea are just exactly like that, and they involve big parties where people give away things, including especially pigs, which have been fattened up specially for these ceremonies. And in the background here, you can see the one with a hat here, that is Onka, who's organizing as a big man this ceremony, and these are people coming to assess the gifts which his community have produced. So okay, so now to contrast, generalized reciprocity, which is, like I mentioned for the Kung, is the basis of all pre-class societies. In which and Yin Paradies talked about some aspects of this. A gift is a generous and helpful donation. What people expect from a gift is not any immediate payback, any kind of equivalent gift, but they expect similar generosity from other people in the future. The reciprocity may not come from the person to whom the original gift has been given. It most likely comes from other people in the community, or quite likely. There's no definite time frame of reciprocity. That's why it's called generalized reciprocity. But there can be quite definite expectations about what is to be given. For example, a hunter might kill a deer, and then various parts of the deer would go to particular relatives, like the hindquarters might go to the great aunt or whatever. So that's generalized reciprocity. Now, the balanced reciprocity, which is the kind Marcel Mauss is talking about in his book on the gift economies, is an expression of competitive masculinity. So leading men in these societies compete with other leading men from other residential groups to prove their status and their masculine prowess by organizing their communities to produce gifts which are bigger than the gifts which are returned. So balance means that the idea is that the other chiefs and big men from that other group will produce a gift that's actually bigger than the first one that's been given. And these ceremonies constitute a substitute for wars and raids between these communities, which are also quite common. So people strive for status by giving more. So rather than, like as in a capitalist society, everyone tries to compete by acquiring more and hanging on to stuff, like exclusive possession is the aim of the game. In these gift economy with balanced reciprocity, it's not like that at all. The status comes from giving more, not from acquiring more stuff. So summarizing both of these kinds of exchange systems, what you could say is that these kinds of non-monetary gift economies actually work. I mean, in the sense that the economy of the society as a key part has these kind of non-monetary gift economies of one kind or another, either generalized reciprocity or balanced reciprocity. And what that implies is that greed and exclusive ownership, the desire for hoarding, etc., which we see as almost innate within a capitalist economic framework, is actually not hardwired as part of the human nature. And instead, what we find is the default position, which organizes the most of the transactions which go on in pre-class societies, depends on an expectation of generosity and useful helpfulness to other people. And what people get out of these gifts is rewards in prestige, affection, and the expectation of reciprocity, either directly like a balanced reciprocity, or in the case of generalized exchange, that at some point you'll get something back. So what we can say about this is that generalized reciprocity is an economic format for a post-capitalist economy based upon the gift, as its key economic format. So to summarize what that would look like, there's a situation where we don't have any money or any equivalent, like cyber money or anything similar to that. The workers control their production in the form, they create voluntary working groups, and then they have the right to allocate their products. They negotiate with the communities the kind of things that are necessary and that people want, and produce things for those particular purposes. The way in which this economy is coordinated is by what Anitra Nelson is referred to as compacts. These are kind of agreements, formal agreements to supply something at a particular time, so that, we will create 10 tons of steel and we will deliver this to your company to your cooperative in February next year, and it will be brought by this particular trucking cooperative, etc., etc. So these are compacts or agreements to supply and receive. So in this context, why it's generalized reciprocity, not balanced reciprocity, is that in most cases there's no expectation of a reciprocal gift. So for example, if a voluntary cooperative is running a train service, they don't expect people getting on the train to provide them with a gift to pay back for the service of using the train. They expect to be just to get on the train as a free gift and make use of that service. So there's a network of exchanges between people which adds up to providing the things that people need rather than reciprocal gifts, in response to any particular gift. So, like in anthropological terms, what we could say then is that the gift economy, the post-capitalist gift economy, depends on a sort of set of economic assumptions, not that different to generalized reciprocity in pre-class societies. So what makes a high-tech gift economy possible? Well, the first thing is, rather than balanced reciprocity, which implies competitive gift exchanges, what we hope for in a post-capitalist economy is the success of feminism as a social movement, and that will have an end to patriarchy and an end to the competitive masculinity that's characteristic of patriarchal societies and animates the balanced reciprocity that Mauss is writing about. We could have what you might well call the Ann Barra child socialization package. So Annette Hamilton studied the Ann Barra people and research in Northern Australia. And basically what she found was that the generosity, the generalized reciprocity and the generosity which animates that in the Ann Barra community comes out of a socialization of infants and young children of a particular type, which is that the demands of infants and young children are generally met by the adults surrounding them, that they expect, like they want the breast, or if they're crying, they get picked up, or, if they want something to eat, they get it, or if they're having, there's a toy that they want, the older child will give them the toy and so on. So that the expectation that children have growing up is that the community will meet their needs. This means that people don't anxiously hoard, they don't feel a need to acquire things, and we can expect a change in socialization to bring about this change in culture, which would enable a gift economy to work. A third thing is an empathetic communication through digital communication. That whereas in any previous period of the world's history, people regarded people from other societies as strangers and potential enemies, what we have now is a possibility through digital communication, like through ethnographic films or documentaries, or even just the news, and certainly through YouTube and things like that, is a sense of where other people are coming from, what their desires are, and so on. We have the possibility of networking economic exchanges across the whole of the globe through digital communications and through transport modes of various kinds. So what we would expect is networks of friends reaching out across communities to allow the production of quite high-tech goods and services, as well as low-tech, self-sufficiency, localized exchanges as the dominant form of the economy. So that these networks of production produce both locally, regionally, countrywide, and global. And that animating all of this is the status associated with useful helping, that people are appreciated for doing things that are useful to other people. So as a final 2 minutes, I'm going to talk about coordination in the gift economy. What people often say is they say, oh, well, I can see how a gift economy would work for a sort of community garden or something like that, but I'm really struggling to understand how it might work for a university or a hospital. In other words, a complex technological enterprise which depends upon players, scattered across the country in different institutions and so on, all supplying various things that particular institution requires to function. The short answer to that question is that the way in which that's all coordinated is through a network of compacts and chains of production. So if a hospital requires rubber gloves, then there's a voluntary community probably in some other residential area, maybe 100 kilometers away, which is making rubber gloves and producing them for hospitals and transporting them to these hospitals to produce it. These are chains of production in the sense that the rubber gloves then function in another role when they get to the hospital and so on. Then the priorities for what are required is also decided by these voluntary clubs consulting their communities to find out what people need and to produce things that are going to be regarded as useful. So there's no centralized coordination. There's no democratic planning for a national economy, that none of these things which we tend to think of as necessary actually happen within the gift economy. And what I'd say about that as an immediate point is that that's not that different to the way a capitalist economy works. There's no central body in the globe that says, well, we're going to need so much iron ore this next year in order to provide, autoclaves in Vladivostok. No one's doing that. What we have is a set of contracts, of economic contracts between different players, which amounts to a coordinated economy. And that the gift economy would work like that, but not through contracts, but through compacts. And I think that this concern that people have about this is actually a displacement. The issue is not actually whether we could coordinate production or not, but whether we could trust voluntary groups and networks to get it right. So we know that in a capitalist society, the sanctions are really obvious. If you fail in your contract, you could be fined, or you certainly won't get the money you're expecting and so on. So there are various kind of sanctions and incentives that go with that. What are the sanctions and incentives in the gift economy? The incentives are the enjoyment of work that will be appreciated, the desire to live in a good environment and so on, the sense of being part of a coordinated project, the willingness to help. And the sanctions are things like the court of public opinion. If you fail to do what you promised, that sense that you're not being helpful. And ultimately, sanctions could be coercive. If you want to put in a nuclear plant that everybody hates, then you won't be permitted to do that. So I'd just like to finish with that. Thank you very much. Okay.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Terry. Anitra, yeah, take it away.
Thanks very much, Tarek. First of all, I'd just like to respectfully acknowledge elders past, present and emerging of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands I live and work, and of the Gunai or Kurnai peoples on whose land I was born, as well as the several Indigenous people who are participating in this webinar. Now, I came to explore, I haven't got any slides. I came to explore non-monetary futures as a writer, artist, and environmental activist. I left school when I was repeating what's now referred to as Year 11. My first jobs included a fish and chip shop, tab agency, carnation factory, libraries, and bookshops. Now, for us, an aspiring writer to see their work mangled through the capitalist system was a wake-up call. Money and markets seemed to be everything. And it seemed you're not even formally recognised as a writer unless you do it as paid work, except, of course, in the underground of alternative worlds where a precarious solidarity reigns. In my jobs and as a consumer, I found that the market is not about delivering on basic needs, but rather encouraging you to squander money on often useless and easily broken or quickly consumed commodities and services. I got sick of being a shit kicker on a very low income, and I was a passionate activist in the late 60s and early 70s, learning from the women's movement, from the United States' reign over Australian politics and United States incursions in Vietnam and Chile. I read The Population Bomb and Silent Spring and engaged in local environmental campaigns. So I was drawn to academic studies mainly to inform my activist intellectual growth and secondarily as a useful qualification. So I enrolled in Latin American studies only to discover that the last few centuries of Latin American history was actually economic history, a history of the ravages of capitalism. destroying Indigenous ways of life in balance with nature, and exploiting landscapes in order to promote a materialist way of life in the global north. When I came to writing a PhD, I focused on the concept of money. Money is fundamental to capitalism. It can't be defined without recourse to money. Perpetual monetary growth is intrinsic to market economies. And capitalism is simply money making more money. It's all about production for trade. And I use the word trade here only for monetary exchange. Very perversely, this market-based system is promoted as giving people freedom. In fact, we live in a world where monetary power rules, where inequities between people are inevitable and regenerated by money, and where it's money or monetary calculations that decide what is produced and how it is produced rather than people. Firms try to get as much free or low-cost water, air, and energy, and then they charge for such freebies and avoid costs of pollution to water and air. The system of private property fragments the holistic earth that's highly respected by Indigenous people, but here in capitalism fragmented into competing spaces producing for the market without knowing whether that produce will sell or go to waste. So production for trade is intrinsically exploitative and wasteful of both people and planet. Moreover, on balance, the state is a capitalist state. It supports capitalism. Socialist states retaining markets have all succumbed to monetary and market rules, failing to institute sound human and ecological values. So I concluded decades ago that both justice and sustainability are really impossible under capitalism, whose fundamental cell and beating heart is money. That's why some of us argue strongly that we need to go beyond money, not just growth. And my main arguments appear in this book. It's available open access, and you can see the links that I've put to the references that I make in chat. My activist side of exploring non-monetary societies and economies drew me to live in two eco-collaborative communities in Victoria during the 1990s. This enabled me to sort of learn firsthand how commoning could exist today and how communities might meet human needs through collective sufficiency. In a recent Nina podcast interview, I talk about the Twin Oaks model discussed in a chapter in a book that I co-edited, which has actually also got a chapter by Terry Leahy in it. And again, that's kind of listed in chat. So the Twin Oaks model in Virginia in the United States informed the development of the first eco-collaborative community that I lived in here in Australia. I lived at Common Ground in its heyday with around 20 members with a common purse, meaning everyone combined their work, incomes and expenditure collectively, deciding how they lived and earned their livelihoods. Even though the residential commune of sorts no longer exists, the Common Ground property and cooperative in central Victoria remains a hub for environmental and social activists. But anyway, I'll explain a bit about how it worked as a residential community back in the 1990s. Because one thing that's key here is that I don't see that alternative monies are what are needed as a substitute for money, but rather people being in control of their own production and consumption. So at Common Ground on Monday mornings, we all met and we divvied up the weekly chores between us so that everyone worked an equivalent of 4 days a week. And the other 3 days we just spent however we individually wished. Our cooperative work included caring for children, vegetable and orchard gardening, attending to chooks, cutting wood, maintenance and cooking meals, which were eaten collectively, general housework and outreach work. All food was quality vegetarian food collectively eaten. Conviviality was a key characteristic of all our relationships. Co-founded by social workers, the cooperative business offered spaces and services for running workshops, forums, and gatherings of social and environmental movements and organisations, and for public servants who provided social welfare. Up to 40 people could be accommodated inside Common Ground's various buildings overnight, and there was space for more people to camp. The cost of using such facilities and the skills of Common Ground residents were negotiated on the basis of clients' capacity to pay. Some were offered free participation. So, Common Ground residents included in their everyday work jobs they included in their everyday work all these jobs associated with hosting, catering for, and professionally assisting client groups and workshop participants. The buildings had been designed by a sympathetic participatory design architect, created collectively using mud brick and second-hand timber on a permaculture design, with construction supervised by a professional builder from another intentional community based in northern New South Wales. Most of the contributions to the work of those buildings was voluntary. So I could go on about that, but I want to jump now to another model which has been written about in sources, again listed in chat. It's called Cargonomia, and it's a multifaceted degrowth cooperative that's based in Budapest in Hungary. Degrowth, in its original French iteration, following Serge Latouche and later Vincent Leahy, a co-founder of Cargonomia, refers to decolonizing our capitalist imaginaries, that's our economistic ideologies, to reveal a world full of qualities that can't be reduced to numbers, as in money and prices, and as Yin emphasized. So degrowth is fundamentally about transforming ourselves to a world where everyone's needs are met modestly within Earth's limits. Cargonomia doesn't include a residential intentional community. Rather, its members and interns live in various household arrangements, but collectively work in a range of degrowth activities. Over the last decade, they've incorporated bike making, bike repair, and bike hire facilities, including cargo bikes, and repair training and equipment hire, along with social events aimed at encouraging bike use. They've collaborated with a peri-urban farm in a community-supported agriculture arrangement where they run permaculture, organic, biodynamic, and agroecology workshops. They incorporate student interns working, researching, and learning on the job, as well as a number of activists and other volunteers. They partner with a range of environmental, social, and political movements and associations on specific activities, such as urban community gardens, and they also work at the farm on the edges of the city. So I refer to these kinds of complexes where people are doing lots of different kinds of degrowth activities and formations and partnering with a lot of other degrowth sympathizing organisations as degrowth formations, like eco-collaborative communities, which include best practice, sustainable co-housing, eco-villages and political squats. Degrowth formations can offer a bridge to post-monetary futures. At the back of the book, Exploring Degrowth, A Critical Guide, Vincent Leahy's inserted appendices from his and others' previous work showing stages by which such formations might become models for neighbourhoods that would progressively become more collectively sufficient and relate to one another on the basis of horizontalist principles. Those are principles based on direct democracy, including general assemblies, delegated and accountable working groups characterised by sociocratic style processes. The two practical examples of cargonomia and common ground point towards global non-monetary futures. What I call a community mode of provisioning would be a global world. Here, millions of communities would aim for collective sufficiency, each one of them within a sub-sub bioregion. And they would exchange with one another on the basis of variable and flexible compacts, as Terry referred to, agreements to satisfy the needs of wider communities on the basis that every community has its needs fulfilled by local or further afield provisioning. This is production on and for demand, demand based on real needs of real people as pre-planned and pre-ordered. In short, semi-autonomous communities plan what they need and produce or make compacts for others' communities to provide so that no markets or money are necessary. Once produced, all the goods and services go to those who ordered them. This is so very different to production for trade, for markets and for money. It's also distinct from socialist central planning or democratic economic planning models. Such non-monetary futures lay the basis for people to live differently, including in various customary Indigenous non-monetary ways, sharing, caring and commoning. A decolonisation of the economic imaginary dispenses with private property and with trade. Socially determined use rights to land by previously colonised peoples allows them to live in non-capitalist ways that they choose. Universal principles accord with people and Earth's needs being met. In this way, our new social contract is to design collective provisioning that serves the purposes of sustaining people and of regenerating Earth. That's it.
Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Anitra. Thanks, Yin. Thanks, Terry. Those were all great. So according to the agenda, we're now to have a little facilitated chat between the three of you. I'm assuming Yin is still there, but he's just hiding his pretty little face for the moment. Oh, there he is. You're muted.
I'm just having some provisioning called lunch, but I'm here.
Ah, yummy, 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 delicious. Yeah, by all means, yeah, fuel yourself up. Um, well, I'm happy to as well, like, be very informal with this and just start taking questions from the chat and from the audience whenever. So. I can ask some of my own questions of our beautiful panel, and as well, if anybody would like to chime in, just unmute yourself or raise your hand with the little button or pop something in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on it. I think we have a question for Yin. Okay. So for Yin from Ilario, he asks, this should be taught in school. How can this type of presentation be introduced at a community level? If people could see and understand this, I would think most would be disgusted that we are still operating on in such a dysfunctional system. I know I was when I first learned about it. I'm disappointed that people tend to sleepwalk through their busy lives without questioning what is going on. We lack real leadership at a political level. So questions and comments there, and yeah, Yin
Yeah.
respond, but Terry and Anitra just jump in if you like.
Well, look, I mean, some people are disgusted. A lot of people prefer the sleepwalking and would go for the denial and distraction. So people are at different places, really. Politicians, I wouldn't expect too much from them. Well, nothing good anyway. So look, I don't think people are all going to be right on board, but sharing the word is definitely a good idea because some people will. So there you go.
Yeah, so Terry and Anitra, did you have any thoughts on
Yeah,
how to get these ideas out to the community? Yeah.
I think I'll make a comment. my book, System Change for a Livable Future, one of the readers of my book is my cousin Sally in Tasmania. And she read to me and said, I'm enjoying your book, but a lot of it sounds like science fiction. And I think that's a very telling comment in a way, in the sense that I think people grasp for a change to capitalism that isn't all that different to capitalism. They want to regulate capitalism more strongly, regulate the market economy more strongly. At the very most, they want government to own capital, and still people still work as wage laborers, like in the social democratic Trotskyist vision. And I think that to suggest a gift economy or an economy without money, with provisioning on demand, like Anitra's talking about, it strikes people as science fiction. And I think partly it's really, like one of the things that this session is about pre-colonial economies. And the minute we start to look at these economies that are not based in the state and not based in class, we see that they are radically different to the kind of economy that we have now. They are as different as science fiction. And I think that what we have to realize is that we need to make a change as drastic as that to get out of class society and to end class society forever.
Yeah, I'm living in Melbourne now, but when I was living in central Victoria, we had Castlemaine Free University, and the Free University used to ran on the principles of no money for speakers, no money for the venue, and we had it in a beautiful venue. And I think that when people start actually doing things like Cargonomia does to some extent, and Common Ground did to some extent, show non-monetary ways, and a lot of different Indigenous communities do exactly the same thing. Zapatistas are really good examples of a whole movement, and in Rahava as well, that are in a sense delinking from money to an extent or another. And in the current situation that we're in, where we're dominated by monetary relations, it's very difficult to achieve. But I am firmly convinced that practical examples are the best ways and forms of education for people to be able to experience things. That's why I really like the idea of eco-collaborative communities, and us all doing collaborative things such as the community gardens or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've started an intentional community, which is a eco, whatever Anitra said, and we don't allow people to pay any money to be part of our community because we don't want that relationship with people. We want a different non-monetary relationship. It does cost a fortune to run a homestead, and that's money that has to come in from me. But it's not what we want to do with people who live here. So, yeah.
Yeah, it was the same with Common Ground. Anyone could join. And it's the same with Twin Oaks in Virginia. Anyone can join it. The monetary aspect of it is irrelevant. It's whether you've got the right kind of sharing skills and aspirations, that kind of thing.
Amazing. Yeah, great discussion, guys. JP, did you want to ask your question, and then I'll go look at some ones from the chat?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, everyone, for these beautiful presentations. The construct of markets really stuck out for me in what you shared, Anitra, and I'd love to hear from all of you on this. So I think most of us are on board with the whole idea of globalism. We focus locally on uplifting the thriving in our area. And we're a global society, right? We have someone from Norway on this call today, for example, and I just got off of a call with probably 17 countries represented. So there's a transition that has to occur, and I'd love to hear your visions for particularly the restoration of commons, things like global air quality and water, and how the heck we do transport. We were chatting yesterday, if supply chains got cut off, Australia would expire for lack of coffee, for example. So, how I would love to hear your visions for how a transition to a non-market model might work for a globally connected world. Anyway.
Yeah, I don't mind having a starting on it. I mean, I envisage two different things at once. One is that we maintain the sort of communications connections that we have with different parts of the world, and that we also maintain a certain amount of exchange of physical products, especially high-tech goods which are produced in stages by chains of production in different, in different connecting to different places. And I think that sort of, on the one hand, that implies, some form of digital communication, but it also implies transport with sustainable things like, sailing ships, airships, trains, et cetera, which can be created in a sustainable way. The other part of the equation, though, is that most production will be for local use, and that it's important. Like, I'm now going to respond to a question from JP about the optimal size of communities. I mean, I think that what we have to look at is the ecological requirements for producing food and using recycling the fertility of human manure, to be quite blunt about it. I mean, that in a sense we need a small community, residential communities, which can operate that system, and that does restrict us. We have to have the farming land, within easy distance for low tech transport options such as bicycles, and maybe ox carts or whatever. And it's like, and we need to be able to move manure and create compost and use wood for timber from local forests and all that. So that implies a lot of production will be for local use, and these communities can't be huge. They're like maybe 10,000. I'm not sure really. So I envisage both of these things happening in once. So I'll finish with that.
Anyone else? To me, this is kind of the real conundrum at the moment, the momentum of what Nate Higgins calls a superorganism, right? So
yeah,
I think people need to be prepared to push the Occupy movement everywhere. I mean, we have systems that mean that 1 billion people on Earth aren't even fed properly enough. And, this is an ethical issue. How come people don't feel strongly enough to say, look, capitalism does not work, and it's wrong, and we want a world where people's basic needs are met and the earth has its regenerative capacity at full tilt. So I think that we have to be really honest about where we're coming from and stand up for our principles. And it's quite interesting that people really like someone like Pauline Hanson standing up for principles. And like, why don't we stand up for our principles? I think people are calling out for that now.
I don't even know if people have principles anymore. It's a very positive view that you have there. For me, I'm going more radical than even Terry's school to be radical. For me, we're not looking at a high-tech future. We're looking at a post-industrial world. So it's post-capitalist, it's post-industrial, and it's post-modern in a different sense to the usual term. And we look, the thing is that the only sustainable model of human organization that we know of is the primal or indigenous model. So we're talking about hunter-gatherer, herder, horticulturalists living in small groups, not 10,000, 150, 200, 300. And we're not talking about a global world. We're not talking about technology. There's no technology connecting people across the globe. There's local networks, continent-wide kinship networks existed on this, what is now called Australia. So we're talking about large connections, but slow, the slow movement, things move slowly, as they should at the human scale. That's a sustainable model of human organization, tried and proven over at least 200,000 years. So why don't we do that?
Well, we'd have to throw away uh, a lot of luxury, that is for sure.
Good. So
Yeah.
we should. Comfort is a curse of modernity.
Yeah, I'd just like to make a few comments on that. One is, I mean, I totally agree with what JP just said. Uh, uh, to a very large extent, it's, people like in the wealthy countries of the world have to go. A lot of what we get through the globalized superorganism is really unsustainable and stupid and unnecessary, and it's not really. We don't need that to live well. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, but I would say this about coffee. We can grow coffee in Australia. It's not a problem at all. I mean, heaps of what we do in Australia is to bring things from the global south because labor's cheaper. It's not because we can't do it, produce it locally. But at a sort of more broad scale level, I mean, I don't agree with what Yin is saying, and the reason is, on the one hand, I think we cannot forget cereal agriculture. And that's the first thing. And the second thing is that uh, patriarchy, um, to end patriarchy, we really need some of the medical technologies that are associated with modernity, like low mortality rate, low death in childbirth, contraception, abortion, and these things which make it possible for a feminist movement to be successful. And the problem I have is that I think the combination of a cereal agriculture that can produce a surplus and patriarchal masculinity is sufficient to produce a class society, so that we could go back, we could make a global decision that we're going to go for horticultural stateless societies, but we wouldn't actually be able to maintain that because what we already have the inventions that scuppered that the last time, and they would do so again.
Yin, would you like to respond to that? This is an interesting contrast in perspectives here, and I think yeah, it would be interesting to tease those out before returning to the questions from the chat. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I don't know how to put it more bluntly, but like I said, there's tried and true methods for how humans have organized sustainably for 200,000 years. Of course, we can go back to them. It's not inevitable. Modernity is not inevitable. You don't always invent agriculture and iPhones. No matter, you just rewind and whatever happens, always an iPhone will appear. That's not reality. They're not inevitable. People can live sustainably. Indigenous societies are not patriarchal. They're mostly weakly matriarchal. So there's no problem with patriarchy there. Just do what's been done and do it properly. It only will only take, seven, at least 7 generations to become remotely Indigenous. It's not a quick process, but it can be done because it has been done. Nothing else has been done. No of the other proposals have been done before.
And to my understanding, from how I'm reading it, anyway, is that you wouldn't necessarily need to like get rid of every single modern technology or thing, like for instance, medical science. I mean, you could democratize that and have that spread more equitably throughout the regions, throughout Australia as a whole. For instance, like it like I just want to clarify that point because I wasn't necessarily getting that from what you were saying, that you like every single piece of modern technology needs to be abandoned writ large. So could you clarify that?
Well, what I said is we need to live in a post-industrial society.
Mm-mm-mm.
So that won't involve high tech. You don't need high tech medicine to have
Mm,
matriarchal cultures.
mm,
What a
mm,
ridiculous notion.
mm,
You don't need industrial anything.
mm,
But human scale and human size technologies that
mm,
have been invented in the last 10,000 years, some of them are fine. There's nothing wrong with a shovel and a wheelbarrow, or a violin, because people can make them themselves.
mm. But what about more like sophisticated pieces of medical technology, for instance, that are sometimes necessary? What would be your stance on that
Why
sort
are
of
they
thing?
necessary? For what?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm obviously my background isn't in medicine personally, but let's just say like something like MRI or, like doing a blood test or something like that, like just very like radiology, like just this sort of stuff. Like,
Most of the problems that we have in modernity are caused by modernity.
mm,
Indigenous peoples were very healthy people. They didn't need blood tests.
mm,
Most of the diseases, infectious and chronic, that we have are a result of modernity.
mm,
Doesn't mean they necessarily will go away.
mm,
But some diseases have been around for a long time, say malaria and tuberculosis. But people do well, that they live in healthy ways and they do well. They don't need blood tests and MRIs. And yes, there probably was higher levels of infant mortality in Indigenous societies than we have in modern times. And once again, we're not in charge of the cosmos, okay?
mm,
We can't have everything. And the fossil fuel um, free lunch that provides things like extremely low infant mortality rates, it's just not sustainable. You can't do it. So move on.
mm.
So I'd just like to make one little comment.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I mean, like 10,000 years BC, agriculture gets invented in a number of different places around the world all at the same time. After 200,000 years of human beings living in egalitarian, you, tribal societies, and then suddenly agriculture gets invented, and then by about 5,000 BC, what we see is class societies popping up in different places around the world, completely independently of each other. Like in China, in Peru, in the Mississippi, not to mention, obviously in the Middle East and Europe and so on. And these class societies are massively successful, and gradually, like a cancer, they take over and have come to dominate the whole globe at the present time. I just sort of I worry that without something different from what we had 10,000 years ago, we'll just cycle through that same situation again.
All right. This has been, yeah, a very intriguing line of inquiry, but I will try to move us on to some of the other questions that are
Okay.
probably in the chat that I haven't looked at. Um, I think there are a lot actually. Does anybody who's posted one want to raise their hands because I've got a lot to scroll through. Just shout out if you have a question. Okay, this is the first one I've scrolled to, so sorry for the lack of equity with questions, if I've missed you. So, is anyone in this field looking at the psychological outcomes of different economies, e.g., excessive narcissism seems an increasing feature and desire of the capitalist system? Has anyone got an idea of the prevalence of narcissism in other societies? Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. So, go ahead and respond to that because I would say a lot of things like the advertising industry and now social media are definitely contributing to narcissism.
Well, I would say that narcissism was very rare in pre-modern societies,
Mm.
because of the culture that as Terry outlined, generosity and gift giving and outdoing each other in generosity, being helpful, caring for others. It's just that's how people did things. So they didn't have a culture that rewarded narcissism like we have now. So it's not quite true to say that for humans as a species, particularly, culture is a very strong determinant of how we act. So we do have some natural tendencies towards greed as well as towards altruism. If you look at the cultures of our most immediate relatives, the chimpanzees and bonobos, they're very different cultures that they have. So we have tendencies, and they can easily be shaped by strong cultures. And I would say that I don't agree with Carol that hunter-gatherer societies discarded people who were disabled or old. I have no evidence of that. There's evidence to the contrary, in fact, of very different ideas of what productivity is within those primal societies.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Yin. I was just kind of forming my response to that. Um, like Indigenous peoples in Australia at the moment don't have problems so much of homelessness as overcrowding, because Indigenous peoples, even today, when a lot of their Indigenous society has been torn from them, they still have the capacity and the principles of sharing and of commoning. And so people all come in, whatever the resource is. So the point is that there's ample evidence, and I think Terry would agree with this, in all of the anthropological works that indigenous ways of living are just much more sharing and caring in their whole way.
Just on that psychology point as well, it's pretty obvious that the more westernized societies become, the more mental illness there is. Is there anything else you wanted to say about that kind of issue? It seems to align with what you were saying, Yin, about all of the diseases that we are having.
Yeah, I mean, modern forms of society are successful in a sense, as Terry said, in like a cancer. And like a cancer, they're not sustainable. And so a lot of diseases emerged in modern times. Virtually all the sexually transmitted infections, cardiovascular disease is very new. It's 150 years ago. Somewhere about 100 to 150 years ago, they just didn't exist. People laughed at the bloke who invented the ECG machine because they thought, well, what the hell would you need to listen to someone's heart for? Pointless. Nothing wrong with people's hearts. So that's created by industrial food poison, essentially. Mental health, yeah. I mean, people didn't have mental health problems like we have now in primal times. Anxiety and depression, epidemics that didn't exist because people were, living in communities that, like Terry said, provided for people's needs. They just assumed their needs would be met by their kin, very broadly speaking, because they were. People weren't lonely. We have a loneliness epidemic now. There's a lot of mental health issues now that were non-existent or very rare in our pre-modern societies, which tells you more about the sustainability, once again, of those societies for humans. Each species on this planet has certain tendencies and certain environments in which it thrives. So a society of humans has certain things that help us thrive. A society if you're an octopus, it's not going to work for you the same things as what humans need. So we're just a species and we have needs, and those needs are not being met in modernity.
I'd just like to say something about the narcissism question. I mean, clearly, the way narcissism operates within a capitalist economy is through hoarding and through, displays of power, like getting a huge gas guzzling automobile and so on. And these are the ways that people reassure themselves that they're, like that either that they're real men or just that they have a status as adults and and they're powerful and so on. Like within indigenous economies, people gain status by looking after other people and by helping the community to live well and by inventing a wonderful new dance style inspired by the ancestors. I mean, it's like the term narcissism only applies to a particular social context, and it means something completely different in different social contexts.
Yeah, well, also hunter-gatherer societies were generally fiercely egalitarian, so they had downward leveling, ego to keep egos smaller. They had downward leveling norms. So showing off in general, most hunter-gatherer societies was not, considered a great idea. And there's ways of, just keeping people equal, egalitarian by, just not expecting people to have big note themselves that much. Not entirely, but in most of them. Yeah.
We had a very interesting question. I'm in the chat. It's a bit long, so I'll kind of paraphrase, but it just mentions that eco-spirituality is equally important to this conversation as well as biophysical limits and logistics and all of this stuff. So I was wondering if the three of you had perspectives on spirituality and its role in all of this.
Well, I think spirituality is very important and essential to human sustainable thriving and nourishment. And we've lost a lot. Obviously, primal indigenous societies were completely suffused with spirituality, ceremony and ritual, and a sense of it's the thing about spirituality is it taps or connects with emotional states, or they're not even really emotional states, they're states of consciousness that we don't experience in modernity. So some words that capture that are things like reverence or ecstasy. Modern humans don't experience those emotions, virtually never, a handful of times in their lives perhaps. But that's the point of ritual and ceremony in a lot of indigenous societies, is to create those very variable and varied states of consciousness that we miss out on in modernity to our detriment. And that's part of the point of spirituality as well.
Thanks, Ian. Anitra or Terry, do either of you have thoughts on this?
Yeah. I mean, I sometimes find it difficult to know what people mean by spirituality. It was interesting what Yin just said about it. And I'd certainly agree with that. I think within the sort of rationalist Western framework, there's an attempt to close off avenues of experience which we associate with spirituality. Like with meditation or with use of hallucinogenic drugs or with just a big community event where everyone feels a sense of being part of something bigger. I mean, these are all experiences which we could call spiritual, and certainly within the Western rationalist framework. And like I think that the sort of ideology of money is built around that. This is all common sense. This is all totally rational. Oh no, we're not involved in anything like that. And I think we need to go beyond that. And I think people have got a sense of that. And also what I also think is that half the time the sort of obsession with consumer goods and expression through that is a situation where those needs for what we could call spirituality are not being met by people's life experiences. And so they go for these substitutes which actually aren't really as good as the real thing, anyway. So I'll just leave it at that.
That's what
Anitra,
I call That's
Or
what I call
token.
misplaced longings, just to say what Terry just
Yeah,
said. Misplaced
yeah,
longings.
totally. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on spirituality, Anitra?
Um, not more than what people have already expressed, really. Yeah.
Okay. Well, then I have an older question for you from up in the chat, which says, Janine, I'm wondering if there is an optimal size for each semi-autonomous community that is living without money. My instinct is that when communities get too large and they're increasingly complex, they may move towards hierarchical organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be correct. That might be correct. But the point is that in the kind of model as I see it, and practical examples that I see, communities are of a manageable size, they're of a small size, and they can easily communicate and make joint decisions across communities. And it doesn't have to be by in a representative hierarchical way, in the way that we experience politics today. It can be by people representing their community, but that would always mean that they would also have to be accountable and 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 people would rotate in representing their communities. And so the whole concept of leadership or whatever would be a generally shared skill among people. I think I've put in as an answer to a similar question that someone asked was in intentional communities, there have been a lot of very long running communities that are around 100, 150. And those kind of communities have the capacity to establish quite a deal of collective sufficiency among them. And and the communities, Twin Oaks is one of those communities, and it has spawned other communities. It gets to a point where it just never gets above much more than above 100 people, and another community starts to exist on a similar basis. And why not that? And like, yeah, I do think that we have this kind of, yeah, a big is necessarily better idea and or concept of you can only be complex if you're big and yeah, all kinds of things. And if anything, I would say small is beautiful.
But also, there's different types of big. So, there's networks of connection for gift giving, for kinship across whole continents. That they're huge.
Exactly. Yeah.
They're huge networks.
Yeah.
They're just not a giant megacity. They're still big, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah, totally.
All right. Well, I think maybe we have time for one more quick question. Let's see what we've got in the chat. Let's see. Okay. I don't know. I'm thinking of, do we want to open up this discussion around computers and tech and them not being able to be produced, or did we more already sort of touch on this theme? Because you have responded to it in the chat. How are you feeling about that?
Degrowth movement talks about convivial technology.
Mm.
And convivial technology is, you go for the simplest way to produce something or to service someone or whatever. But simple in the sense that it's still got to be quality. So there's a much greater emphasis on quality. The things that you create, and a bike is a good example as compared to a car, is that you really need to have things that are very durable, that are so easy to make that when human beings look at it, they can work out how it was all put together. This means that it's easy for everyone to repair. and for it to be long-lasting and durable. All of the technologies need to be looked at in terms of how much they exploit the earth in order to create, and whether they necessarily exploit people. People talking about sophisticated technologies, and the majority of manufacturing is provided to Australians from people who are working in China under the most appalling conditions, and they're really exploiting Earth with all of the kind of ideas of green economies of the future. It's rare earth minerals, which, if you want to exploit in Australia, which a lot of people are seriously thinking of doing, is going to wreck Indigenous communities. And like, honestly, I just find all of those things have such monstrous shadows around them that they're not worth thinking about.
I think that's a great point, Anitra. Yin, did you want to say something?
Just agree with Anitra, convivial tools is a term that was first coined by Ivan Illich, and it's really just about human scale and human level tools that, for me, it's about not being industrialized and centralized. Central industrialization is often centralized, can maybe be decentralized somewhat. But we can't go around ripping up all the rare earth to electrify the future. And technology, is gone too far. A little bit of technology at the human scale. Sure, crafted by people's hands, anything that you can craft by hand is good with me. Anything else is not good.
Well, Terry, did you have one final comment?
Yeah, I agree with what's being said about technology by Anitra and Yin. I mean, basically, we use heaps of high-tech goods that are completely unnecessary to live well. Like, we live in houses made with fired clay bricks when we could be using mud bricks. We travel around our communities in gas guzzling petrol vehicles that we could replace with bicycles and donkey carts. I mean, it's like there's heaps of ways in which the technology that we use is the reason why these things are produced and sold is because it makes sense in terms of the profit motive. If we start to look at real human needs and what and like Anitra was talking about, the human cost of producing these high-tech goods, we'd use a lot less of them, very, very, very much less of them than we do now, and we live much better and have much more enjoyable lives.
Thanks, Terry. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And a heartfelt thank you to you, the three of you, Yin, Terry, Anitra, for helping us imagine different ways of organizing economic life. And thank you, everybody, for bearing with us with the technical difficulties at the start of the session. That's much appreciated. If you'd like to revisit today's discussion or share it, there will be a video recording available on the New Economy Network Australia's YouTube channel. So do check that out. So if you'd like to continue some of the discussions we've had today or exploring these ideas around Indigenous knowledges and commoning and post-growth futures, please do join the Ninosphere. So as you probably know by now, the New Economy Network Australia is a member-led cooperative that brings together people from across different movements, sectors, and backgrounds to learn from one another and explore practical pathways towards a fairer, more regenerative economy and Australian society. So, if you're a current member, you should already have received an invitation to join the Ninosphere. And for new members or people renewing, it's $30 a year or $20 for concession or unwaged. So I'd love to continue the conversation with all of you in the Ninosphere. Again, thanks to everyone for being here, and especially to Yin, Terry, and Anitra. Much love, everyone.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you
Thanks,
very
Terry.
much. Thanks.